Hello, science students. Today we're going to be going over the first unit activity. When you get to the activity, it should be what are the variables? And go ahead and click on this first link right here. This should open another tab, and make sure over here to the right, it should say use template. You want to go ahead and click on use template there on the right. And what that's going to do is pull up in a nice way that makes it very editable. All right. Now there's some stuff here. You could read this objective and you could read this introduction, but I'm not going to. So blah, blah, blah. You could read that if you want. It's some interesting stuff, but the main thing I want you to kind of see is actually we're going to scroll down, 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 and we're going to talk a little bit about this section right here. So we're going to start actually with task 2, paraphrasing and examples. All right. So the important thing I want to show you here are the different types of variables in any experiment. One thing you're going to hear a lot about is the independent variable, the dependent variable, and the control variable. Now, let's go and start with the independent variable. Independent variable in an experiment is the variable that you are changing. So I'm changing this from that. So this is something that I am changing in an experiment. Okay. So what would be an example of something that you change? Okay, so let's say you have an experiment, and in this example, we're going to plant some pea plants. We're going to plant some pea plants into some soil. All right. And the thing we're going to change is the amount of sunlight that the pea plants get. All right. So an example might be, I am conducting an experiment with pea plants, and I am going to change the amount of sunlight plants get. So this example of an independent variable, the thing I'm changing or varying is the amount of sunlight that these plants are getting, right? So once I'm altering that thing, I want to see how those plants are changing. So how much they are growing or how big they've gotten. So a dependent variable is something I'm measuring. So I change something in an experiment. So I have some plants that get a lot of sunlight. I have some plants that get not very much sunlight, right? So that's an independent variable, something I am changing. But then the dependent variable is something you're measuring. So this is something that I am measuring in an experiment. Okay, something you're measuring in an experiment. So in this example with the pea plants, we might want to measure the height. I measure the heights of the pea plants. Spelled heights wrong. Okay. So this would be an example of a dependent variable, but you could also look at the color of the plant. So that'd be another example of something you can measure, right? Or you can measure how many peas they produce, right? So these are all things that you can measure. You could add these to the examples as well. Or if you think of something completely different, go ahead and knock yourself out. Now the control is something that doesn't change from one test subject to another. So I'm only changing, in this example with the pea plants, I'm only changing the amount of sunlight. So I don't want to change anything else because I want to see how the sunlight affects. If I change out sunlight and I change out soil and I change out how much it gets watered, then I'm changing too many things and I can't tell if the sunlight is having a good effect or not. So in an experiment, if I'm just testing one thing, in this case, how much sunlight I should give the plant, well, then I want to keep everything else the same throughout. So in this example, my control variables will be the amount of water given to the plants. What else? The type of soil. The type and amount of soil given to the plants. And of course, the type of plant. All right. Now you can think of probably some other control variables that you don't want to change in this experiment. So these are control variables are things that do not change from one group to the other. So you're controlling for other variables. Okay, hope that made sense for the most part. So let's go ahead and look at some more examples. So we're actually going to go now to task 1, identifying the variables. So now we have an idea of what independent, dependent, and control variables are. Let's go ahead and look at some examples. So identify the 3 types of variables for each example experiment below, and then provide an explanation as to why you identified the variables in the way that you did. The variables include the following: independent variable, dependent variable, and control variable. So let's look at this first example. And for each of these, we're going to want to find independent variable. I don't want this underlined here. Independent, dependent, and control. So you're going to want to find independent variable, dependent variable, and control. I'm actually going to copy that, and I'm going to put it under each of these problems, because for example 1, 2, and 3, we're going to need to find the independent, dependent, and control variables. Let's go ahead and read example 1 and see if we can identify these variables. You would like to add some depth and charm to your garden by adding different size plants to your garden. You've done some research and would love to see a plant chimney bellflowers because of their appeal and height. One of the questions that comes to your mind is which brand of fertilizer to use in order to produce the tallest bellflowers. All right, so the independent variable is the thing that I'm going to be changing. So in this case, I'm changing the brand of fertilizer that I'm using, right? So I have some flowers, some of them with this brand of fertilizer, and then some of them with a different brand of fertilizer. And this is something I'm changing. That's your independent variable. Brand of fertilizer. I'm also going to put for the explanation, let's go ahead and put independent, dependent, and control here as well. So what makes this an independent variable? Well, this is what I am changing between groups. So you have your different experimental groups. So one of them might get fertilizer A, some other one get fertilizer B. Maybe you have a third group with fertilizer C. Okay, so it might be multiple groups like that. Dependent variable is what you're measuring. So again, what you're hoping for is increased height in the flowers, right? So what makes it the dependent variable is the height of the plants. And what makes it a dependent variable? This is what we're measuring. We are measuring the heights of the plants. Control. So control are all the things that you do not change from one group to the other. So there's many things that you want to control for. So they want to give them the same amount of water, same amount of sunlight, same amount of same species of plant, right? So those are all examples of control variables. So amount of sunlight, the type of plant, and amount of water. And there might be more control variables. If you could think of more that you want to be the same between groups, then you can list those as well. So what makes these control variables? All of the groups should have the same. And I'll just copy this right here. Copy, paste. Should have the same amount of sunlight, type of plant, and amount of water. There you go. Okay. All righty. Gonna go ahead and control B. Okay, let's go and look at this second example. Your younger brother has asked you to help him with his 5th grade science fair project. One of the areas he is interested in knowing more about is acid rain. You decide to simulate acid rain by creating an experiment that involves vinegar and limestone chips. You and your brother decide to determine if the amount of vinegar will impact the limestone chips mass. You set up 4 different treatments. Each treatment will contain a different percentage of concentration of vinegar, but with the same initial mass of limestone chips. You both take a hypothesis and discuss how it relates to the acid rain together, and then illustrate the results on the trifold board. Okay. So what thing are you changing from one group to the other? Well, the amount of vinegar that you're putting onto the limestone. We'll put the amount of vinegar in each group. So that's something that you're changing from one group to the other. We are changing the amount of vinegar, which basically changes the amount of acid, right? So this is simulating acid rain, right? Because vinegar is acidic. So we want to see how that vinegar affects the limestone. That might help us see what acid rain would do to limestone as well. Dependent variable is what you're measuring. So what are we measuring? In this case, the mass of the limestone chips. Okay. What makes it the dependent variable? This is what we're measuring. Okay. Control variable. So these are things that each group has that should be identical. So an example of the control group is the amount, the initial starting mass of the limestone. The initial mass of the limestone. And yeah, I think that's about it. The amount of limestone that each group has initially should be the same. All right, example 3. In your biology class, you've learned a lot about marine ecosystems. It has created an interest in maybe one day being a marine biologist. You've decided that you will design an experiment that looks at the impact of rising sea temperatures on the quality of algae in a specific ocean site. You will determine the number of algae under varying temperatures at this ocean site. You are hoping that these findings will help you become more of an advocate for marine life in this time of global climate change. Okay. Let's see. So let's take a look at our independent variables. So something that we're changing between groups, right? So design experiment looks at the impact of rising sea temperatures. So the thing that we are looking at, or that changes between groups, is the temperature of the water. What makes it the independent variable? This is what is different between groups. What's a dependent variable? Well, dependent variable is something you're measuring, right? So we want to look at, what are we measuring? Well, the quality of the algae, right? And the number of algae, the quality and quantity of the algae. Okay. Simply put, this is what we're measuring. We are measuring the amount of algae in each group. And the control variables. So there's plenty of control variables, right? So think about, the water needs to be the same. So the water, the solidity of the water, maybe. Salinity. All right, salinity of the water, which means how salty the water is. The species of algae, right? We'll just say and here. So the salinity of the water and the species of algae. So what makes this control is, well, this needs to stay the same between groups. So I want you to state that there. All right. Now, what are some clues or cue words that help us to see when the variable is coming up? So back on task 2, we're actually going to do this independent variable cue words. So an example would be brand. So we're going to add that, brand. But what's another word that indicates that, oh, maybe this might be the independent variable here? Well, another example might be change, or change. What are some other things? Well, the effect of, that's another one. The effect of, right? So when it says, what's the effect of changing this, right? So that tells you, oh, that's probably your independent variable. Okay. Those aren't the only things. A lot of times you just have to read and kind of understand what's being said or being tested. The dependent variable might be the result, resulting, right? So if you hear the word resulting, like, oh, what's the resulting mass? So mass could be another one. Or height could be another one. Okay, so what's usually it'll say, oh, we want to see this, right? So we want to see a particular outcome or the resulting outcome, resulting height, mass, whatever. Okay. Or amount of. So if I see the term amount of, that's another indicator. All right, so now let's go ahead and move on to task 3. Review the graph below and determine which is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable. Afterwards, generate an experimental question that would align with the data presented to you in the graph. Lastly, what could you what could be some control variables of your generated question? All right, so let's go ahead and look at this graph here. Generally, when you're looking at a graph, they're already kind of telling you the independent variable and the dependent variable. The independent variable, and this goes for in math as well, the independent variable is along the horizontal axis. So usually that's your x-axis is your independent variable. So in this case, the independent variable is the study time. The dependent variable is usually your vertical axis, so your y-axis. In this case, our dependent variable is the percentage on a test, so test score, basically, right? So we're seeing study time versus test score. The independent variable being study time, dependent variable is the percentage on the test. So what's the independent variable and dependent variable? So go ahead and fill those out. I already explained them here. What's a generated question that this graph seems to want to answer? Well, the generated question might be, does study time affect the score, the resulting score on an exam? Well, I shouldn't say exam, on a test. They use the word test. I should say test. Okay. What are possible control variables? Well, we want to give all the students the same test, right? All students are given the same test. Test and testing environment. You don't want to give some kids a test where it's like noisy and loud, and then some kids a test where it's like quiet and easy to concentrate, right? So one of the control variables, or one of the things you don't want to change, is the test and also the environment that you're taking the test in, right? You don't want those things to affect the results, right? Okay, what can you conclude about the graph? So when looking at this graph, we can kind of see that for those that studied 0 hours, they did the worst. And you could see as study time increased, the score also increased up to a point, right? So you could see after you've studied for 8 hours or 10 hours, the score actually went down, which is kind of strange, but it kind of makes sense in a way, right? Like if you stayed up all night studying, well, you're actually doing some harm, right? Because you're staying up all night, you're not getting sleep, which is in a lot of ways just as important as studying, right? So it seems like from the chart, we can see that studying has a positive correlation with test score. Up to a point. Right. So yeah, don't want to overstudy and lose sleep over it. Okay, task 4, it's your turn. Remember the question about the brothers working on determining the impacts of acid rain? Well, now it's your turn to create a similar experiment, simulating the impacts of acid rain given these materials. So you can see we have 2 leaves here, 2 eggshells, and 2 paper clips. So it might be kind of hard to see there, but pictured above, leaves, eggshells, and paper clips. Note, you can use more than the given materials pictured above. So on top of these materials, we also probably want to use vinegar. That's what they used in the experiment before. Remember the limestone chips? With that experiment, they used vinegar, and we could do the same here because that can simulate acid rain because it's an acidic liquid. Be creative and determine these several points of your experiment, and then write a 1-page directions page highlighting the points below for someone else to actually do the activity or lab. So generate a question. So the question that we want to generate, we can state here. What's the question we want to generate? So the question we want to generate is, how does an acidic liquid affect the mass of various materials? Okay, so that's the question, right? I want to put a question mark there. So we're going to basically put vinegar on one of the leaves and then not on the other. Put vinegar on one of the eggshells, but not on the other. And then same with the paper clip. And we're going to compare the mass of these. In other words, we're going to weigh them before and after to see how it affects it, right? So it would be control variables. We are going to use the same materials for both groups, both experimental groups. Yeah. Okay. The independent variable is the thing we're changing. So the independent variable is the amount of vinegar put on to the objects. Okay. Dependent variable is whatever we're measuring as a result. The mass of the objects after vinegar, after being soaked in vinegar, let's say. Okay. So then we want to write a directions, how to conduct this experiment. So one thing, we want to collect the materials. So let's first talk about the materials needed for this experiment. So we're going to collect various materials. For the experiment. I'm going to let you fill this out. What materials are we going to need? So again, we're going to need 2 leaves, and ideally you make the leaves of equal size. 2 leaves, 2 paper clips, 2 eggshells. Again, the eggshells want to be of the same size. And we're also going to need vinegar and perhaps some cups to put the experimental group in. Okay. So I want you to explain that there. Then what we're going to do is take 1 leaf in 1 cup and 1 leaf in another cup. In 1 cup, we're going to put just water. In the other cup, we're going to put vinegar. Okay. And then you're going to do the same for the paper clips. So 1 cup paper clip with just water, 1 cup paper clip with vinegar. Then the same with the eggshells. 1 cup with eggshell and water, 1 cup eggshell and vinegar. So I want you to explain that there. And what we're going to do is measure the difference in mass between those that were in the water versus those that were in the vinegar. And we're going to hopefully perhaps see if the vinegar had an effect on the resulting mass of these objects. Okay, I just explained the whole experiment to you and how it needs to be conducted. I need you to type that out. And that's it. If you need to rewatch this part of the video to hear that explanation again, then you're just going to have to rewind and watch it again. All right. Well, with that, I hope that made sense for the most part. And I hope you're able to get through it. If you have any questions, you can comment them below. And with that, I'll see you guys next time. Take care.